Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar about understanding the visa bulletin. Tonight, we are going to hear from Elissa Taub, who I will let introduce herself in just a few minutes. But I'm going to give everyone a couple seconds to still log on and get settled before we dig into that. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Peyton Jennings. I'm the Physician Engagement Coordinator here at PracticeMatch. Some of you attending might already know me because I work closely with the PracticeMatch's physician ambassadors that we have. And then I also work at a lot of the virtual career fairs. So if you attend the virtual career fairs, I'm there. Since you're here tonight, hopefully you know a little bit already about PracticeMatch and all that we have to offer physicians. And if not, I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that we have. We have a free CV builder and free expert CV review. We have residency scholarships, the virtual career fairs, the monthly webinars that you're attending now, and physician immigration handbook, access to the physician career guidebook, and much more. But I just wanted to take a note and say that microphones will be muted throughout this presentation, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. But I know that Elissa said that she will answer questions as she goes. So if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will make sure to get those answered. So Elissa, if you want to take over and introduce yourself.
Yep. Thanks so much, Peyton. It's great to be here with you all this evening. So just a little bit about me before we get started. I'm an immigration attorney. I'm a partner with the law firm Siskin Susser. We are an immigration boutique law firm, which means that is the only kind of legal matters that we handle are U.S. immigration. And I head up our firm's healthcare immigration practice. So we work a lot with physicians, healthcare practices, hospitals, anything that touches on healthcare. We handle immigration matters for it. And I'm also co-author of the Physician Immigration Handbook that Peyton mentioned. So that's kind of important. If you ever meet me in person, you'll probably be in a place where I have hard copies of them, as opposed to the electronic ones, the PDFs that we usually send out. So anyway, I wanted to talk about the visa bulletin tonight. I know that it's an issue, a topic that is constantly being discussed. I know there's a lot of misinformation, and really not even misinformation, but a lot of misunderstanding about what the visa bulletin does, who creates it, what does it say, what does it mean, and where it's going. So we're going to talk about a lot of those things tonight. I think a couple of years ago, we did a similar webinar, but of course, the visa bulletin comes out every month. So there's always different things going on. And I think this particular time is ripe for a discussion about the visa bulletin. And we'll talk more about that as we go. As Peyton mentioned, I am happy to answer questions as I go. I'm pretty good at monitoring the Q&A in the chat. A couple of things about questions. I can't predict the future. I don't know where the visa bulletin is going. I checked right before we started here. The August visa bulletin is not out yet. August, September, October, these are big months for the visa bulletin, and I just can't give you numbers and know exactly where they're going to be. And at the same time, it's hard for me to say if you have a particular priority date and you're waiting in a backlog exactly when you might get your green card. It's just hard to know, exactly what will happen over the next however many years. The other couple of things, I'm happy to answer questions, but just be careful about really case-specific questions. This is not a confidential forum. It's being recorded. If you have a question about your specific case, I might give you a more general answer because, we can't talk confidentially about your situation. And if you already have an immigration lawyer who's working with you, I also want to be careful about giving you advice on a case where maybe I don't have all the facts and you've already got counsel. So just a few housekeeping matters about questions. With that said, let's dive in and talk about the visa bulletin. And if I can get there we go. So we're going to start big picture and kind of drill our way down to actually looking at the July visa bulletin and kind of going through the different boxes and columns on there. But at its very base, we need to talk about the basics of green cards and why we even need a visa bulletin. The reason for that is that the government of the United States limits the number of green cards that can be issued in a federal fiscal year. That fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. So it's not on the calendar year, it's on that fiscal year. We limit overall the number of green cards that can be issued, and then we split them up into employment-based and family-based categories. So EB for employment, F or FB for family. And then we further go down and we, allocate them through preference categories, EB 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, F 1, 2, 3, 4. And you see there in parentheses, it says immediate relatives. Those are spouses and parents of US citizens who are in an uncapped category of immediate relatives. And then within those big categories, we even have more subcategories, right? So like EB2 has perm cases, it has NIWs, it has some other stuff. So every category has some, has a lot of meat to it, right? There's a lot of people who are applying in each category. So this is just the big picture. And I like this upside down triangle graphic because that's really what we're going to do during this discussion tonight, is kind of start at the baseline, talking about the most general topic and making ourselves more specific. So the allocation of green cards amongst all of those categories is really complicated. And I will tell you that one of the reasons that I went to law school and I didn't become a doctor myself is that I'm really not that good at math. I try to avoid it at all costs. If you've ever talked with a lawyer, you've probably heard that before, but it's super true. So I'm going to do my best with these numbers. But basically, at a baseline, there are 140,000 employment-based green cards available every year and 480,000 family-based green card. From there, there's a really complicated system to account for those immediate relatives that we said that are uncapped, but keep a minimum number of family-based green cards available. But if all of those family-based green cards aren't available in the next year or aren't used in the next year, those leftover family-based green cards will spill down into the employment categories. And if there are extra employment-based green cards, they will spill back into the family categories. And basically what the government is trying to do is make sure that in any fiscal year, and over time in successive years, that one way or another, all of the green cards are being used. If you've been paying any attention over the last several years, you know that there are times when the government does not use all of the available green cards. There have been inefficiencies, there has been mismanagement that led to wasting of a good number of green cards in fiscal year, I think it was 2022, like in the year 2021 into 2022, which was very frustrating. But to kind of give you an idea, like the calculations that go into creating the visa bulletin are all based on this supply of green cards and, versus the demand of all of the applications that are being filed. The other thing I'll mention is at the end of 1 year, we'll get into that in a second, but basically there's a spillover from family to employment, employment to family. We have a year when all of the available green cards are used, there isn't going to be a spill down. And then we're going to be at those baseline levels. And that's kind of what's going on right now. And we'll get into that more in a few minutes. So this is, the general what's going on with numbers of green cards. If the US government, if the US Congress decided that they just wanted to give green cards to whoever was eligible for them, we would not be having this webinar, right? This whole situation is because there is a total limit on the number of green cards and then further limits by category, right? So we look at this on the macro level, but those 140,000 employment-based green cards are then further allocated amongst the EB 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And those family green cards for the immediate relatives are then allocated F1, 2, 3, 4 and all of its subcategories. So you can see that in each little category, it's not like you have access to all of the green cards that are issued. And as I mentioned, there's spill down from employment to family and vice versa. There's spill down within each of those little categories as well. So there, if all of the EB1 numbers aren't used, they're going to spill down to EB2 to 3 and so forth. The more demand there is on the system and the fewer leftover green cards there are, the less spill down we see. In addition to those limits, in addition to the hard limits on the number of green cards that can be issued, we also have the nasty per country caps. If you've been paying attention, you kind of know what these are, but basically Congress passed a law a long time ago that says that no country can account for more than 7% of the green cards that are issued in a given category. And we're talking about these little subcategories of EB2, EB1, F1, F2. So you can imagine on the employment-based side, well, you don't have to imagine, we know that, nationals of India and China have significant backlogs in EB2 and EB3 and even in EB1 now. And for EB4 and EB5, there are other backlogs. And on the family base, we see a lot of backlogs for people from Mexico and other Central American and South American countries. So there are backlogs both on the employment and family-based sides of green card processing. So let's do a little bit of a history lesson and talk about what retrogression is and where we are today with the Visa Bulletin. And then we're going to talk about the Visa Bulletin itself and kind of do a deep dive on reviewing it and kind of looking at the different categories and what they mean. I think it's important for us to look back because right now what we are seeing is a lot of pullback in the Visa Bulletin. We're seeing a lot of retrogression where the numbers move backwards. The available green cards seem to be shrinking, and therefore the ability for folks to actually receive their cards is diminishing. And it's doing that almost across the board. And there are real reasons for this. It's, whether the extremes that the Visa Bulletin has gone to over the last couple of months are warranted is a question I can't really answer. But the pullback isn't entirely shocking when we look at the history and where we've been. Obviously we had a pandemic, 2020 into 2021 into 2022. And at the beginning of the pandemic, in June of 2020, the then president issued a proclamation that banned the issuance of green cards to anybody who was outside the United States. So if somebody was processing a green card at a US consulate or embassy abroad, they were per se ineligible at a baseline. They were ineligible to receive that green card. There were exceptions and, ways to get around that. But for the vast majority of folks who process abroad, most of which are family-based green cards, they were out of luck and they were not able to get their green cards until that ban was lifted in the early part of late winter, early spring of 2021. That ban was lifted. That ban created a backlog of over 400,000 applications that the Department of State needed to process, but couldn't process during the ban. So then they had to start digging out of that backlog. And I use the term backlog, but in this case, it was a processing backlog, not a scarcity backlog. But the upshot of the whole thing was that because the Department of State couldn't issue all those green cards, and most of those were family green cards, at the end of 2020, in October of 2020, we saw a huge spill down of unused family-based green cards into the employment categories. And you might remember that in October of 2020, a lot of people got to file adjustment of status applications who had been waiting a very, very long time to do so. And, fast forward to 2023, and a good number of those folks have received green cards by now. Not all of them, but a lot of them have. Because that ban persisted into the next fiscal year and went into the early part of 2021, there was another spill down that happened in October of 2021, but it wasn't quite as dramatic as the 2020 spill down because the Department of State had opened up. They were starting to issue more green cards abroad. And so there weren't quite as many green cards available. But we also saw USCIS not act super diligently and deliberately to approve as many green cards as possible. There was a change in administration. There was a lot of mess going on there, and they just didn't get the job done. And so at the end of the fiscal year in 2021, so when we went into, that fall, we lost a lot of green cards and into last year as well. Today, we fast forward, right? So we talked about kind of where we were. There were all of these extra green cards available. I think in the last fiscal year, there was a record number of green cards available. And so governments approving green cards left and right, as many as they could. Well, all of that is done now. right? The Department of State is largely caught up in its processing, not saying it's fast, but they're largely caught up. All of those cases, a lot of those cases that were pending from COVID times have been adjudicated. They're out of the system and they're back to a more normal processing. All U.S. embassies and consular posts that are active are handling cases, and, you know, nobody's shut down for COVID anymore. And so just in the last month or so, USCIS and the Department of State have told us in multiple forums that they are going to use every available green card this year. So that means that at the end of this fiscal year on September 30th, we don't anticipate any spill down. We anticipate that for the next fiscal year, for the 2024 fiscal year, we're going to see the government have as many green cards as available as the baseline provides in the law, and really not anything extra. And not anything extra spilling down from family to employment or vice versa. What does that mean? Well, it means that like the flush green card landscape that we were in for the last few years has ended. And that's why we're seeing this retrogression take place. We're seeing the supply not be available to meet the demand of people who are filing for green cards. And the demand is at all-time highs. I don't have the specific data, but the demand for green cards, and when I say demand, I'm talking about people filing I-140s, people filing I-485s. The demand is at all-time highs when you look at, you know, who's in the pipeline. And Congress has not acted to change what's available. So from a pure economic standpoint, you know, things were going to pull back. What's a little surprising to me is exactly where they're pulling back and how far, and we'll talk about that on the next few slides. But it's really important to know that USCIS and the Department of State can only do so much because they're limited by these limits. There are some policy changes they could make to, you know, help, but by and large, they are powerless to increase the number of green cards that are available. Only Congress can do that. Those limits are written into the statute, and only Congress can pass federal legislation. And the only way to really make this better is to not only get rid of the per country caps, but to get rid of green card caps altogether, or at least raise them significantly to bring them into the 21st century, you know, and in line with more modern migration patterns that are happening. These rules were passed in the early 20th century when somebody had to get on an ocean liner to cross an ocean, not on a plane, right? So we just have a very different, you know, the world is set up a lot differently than it was 100 years ago, and it's really time for these things to be updated. So that's a little bit about where we are with retrogression and why we're seeing things pull back now. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Visa Bulletin itself. The Visa Bulletin is a publication of the U.S. Department of State. It is not published by USCIS. It is a State Department document. It is created in collaboration with USCIS, but it is put out by the Department of State. And I've given you there the very complicated link to get to the Visa Bulletin page. But really, if you Google the month, the year, and Visa Bulletin, it will be the first thing that comes up in your feed. So if you Google July 2023 Visa Bulletin, it'll be right there at the top. If you just look at the Visa Bulletin page generally, though, you'll come to this, what looks like this, and you get this month's Visa Bulletin, which is July, and then it'll say upcoming Visa Bulletin, coming soon. And I just checked before this webinar, August is not out yet, but literally it could come any day now. The Visa Bulletin usually comes out in the middle of the month for the next month. So the August Visa Bulletin will come out sometime in mid-July. September will come out in mid-August. You get the idea. We are now at the end of the fiscal year, right? We are in the last quarter of the federal fiscal year, which is going to end on September 30th. These are the months where things get really tight with the Visa Bulletin because the government has used a lot of green cards. And so there's not a lot left at this point in the year. So it is not surprising to see a lot of contraction at this time of year. We started seeing it this year in like May, which was a lot earlier than we thought. But then what happens in October when the full spectrum of green cards becomes available again is that there's usually some forward movement. And of course, we just don't know what that's going to look like for this year. But going back a second, so we have the State Department putting this out, and I said that they do that in collaboration with USCIS. So as I mentioned, the Department of State manages all of the green cards that are issued outside the United States. And USCIS manages all of the green cards that are issued inside the United States. So they have to collaborate because each agency has their own accounting mechanisms for determining how many green cards are available. I think the Department of State's accounting is a little more reliable than USCIS is, just in my own personal opinion. And so sometimes USCIS, it feels like maybe they don't necessarily feed the Department of State the most accurate data. And sometimes it feels, and I think it feels like to us immigration lawyers, and it certainly feels to folks, to applicants who are waiting and waiting, that sometimes some games are played with the visa bulletin either to stoke demand or to quell demand. And what I mean by that is if USCIS feels like it has capacity to handle a bunch more cases and they think that the available green cards are going to be there, they'll tell the Department of State, hey, you can move those dates forward a whole bunch and we'll let all of these people file so we can get them in the system. But if they feel like, hey, we've got so many cases in the pipeline that we could not possibly approve them in the next 5 years or whatever, well, things are going to roll back to quell demand because there's just not going to be enough visas available for the folks that might want to file. So I think there's some of that, which isn't really the appropriate way to handle it, in my opinion, but I think there's some of that going on. But basically, we're going to dive into the visa bulletin in a second, but I want to give you an idea of what you're going to look at when you get into the visa bulletin. The visa bulletin is split into a few different sections. There's a section for family-based categories, there's a section for employment-based categories, and there's a section for the diversity lottery, and then there's some advice sections or kind of notes at the bottom. It's a really important document to spend a little time and really read the whole thing. It's hyper technical. I don't know too many people outside of immigration lawyers that really delve deep into it. I read it every month. It is part of my, when somebody messages me and tells me it's out, I drop everything and I sit and I pull up this, the next month and the current month and compare. So I'm definitely a visa bulletin geek. But it's technical. Within each of those categories, I said there's family-based, there's employment-based, and there's diversity lottery. In the family-based and employment-based sections, there are two charts. There's a final action date chart and a filing date chart. And I know that there is a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about what those are. What does it mean to be a final action date? What does it mean to be a filing date? And it's really not that hard, but to understand. But there's really not a great place. It's not explained well in the visa bulletin. And it's hard to kind of figure out, to wrap your brain around exactly what the government's telling us. So back before the Obama administration, there was only a final action chart. And what that shows is what visa availability looks like in the month. So for the month of July, the final action chart shows that for people, and here, let's go to the next page. So here's a snippet of the July visa bulletin from the final action chart, and I'm just giving you a small snippet of EB 1, 2, and 3. What this means is the EB1 category for everybody but China and India, there's a C there and it says it's current. So anybody who files an adjustment of status application, who has an approved I-140 in the EB1 category can file an adjustment of status application in July. Anybody who, other than those from India or China who might have a pending adjustment of status application in the EB1 category would be eligible to have that application approved because a visa number is going to be available. That's what that C means. There are visas immediately available in that category. You can see from this that EB1, all chargeability areas, basically everybody but India and China, is the only section of the current visa bulletin that is relevant to our discussion that has a C. There is a backlog for every single other category. So going down the left-hand side, you see the first, second, third preferences. That's EB 1, 2, 3. And we have our countries going across the top. If we look at EB2, you see a cutoff date for all chargeability areas except those listed. And it says February 15th, 2022. What that means is that only cases with priority dates before February 15th, 2022 are eligible to be approved. And in this month, it also means that only cases with priority dates before February 15th, 2022 can actually file adjustment of status applications with USCIS. If you're applying abroad, it means that if you don't have a current priority date, if your priority date is February 15th or after, you won't be able to get your green card abroad either. That's what those cutoff dates mean. And on the final action date, we are talking, final action chart, we are talking about right now. What is current in this month? Who can be approved? Who can file in this month? You'll notice here for EB2 India, which is where I spend most of my days in my practice, we're talking about a current priority date, of January 1st, 2011. You can see there is a huge difference between the rest of the world and India. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this webinar that that's the case, but it's very stark when you look at those numbers. So what this means is that, in order to have your adjustment of status approved in the month of July 2023, you need to have a priority date before January 1st, 2011. It wasn't too long ago that these numbers were 2013, 2014, 2012, like they were much later than this. This summer, they have rolled way back. And that all goes back to the supply and demand issues that we were talking about before. Now, did they have to roll back this far? That's a question that's hard to answer because we don't necessarily have all of the raw data to be able to check the government's work. From talking with colleagues, there's a general sense that they went way back to kind of head things off at the pass. And come October, we're going to see some more forward movement, but I don't think we're going to get that far. So it'll be interesting to see what that October final action date visa bulletin looks like when it comes out in September. The other thing you'll notice here for EB3, if we look at all chargeability areas except those listed, which is the whole world other than these particular countries, current priority dates are before February 2022. And one of the things that this has really affected is the immigration of nurses to the United States. So I know tonight, we talk a lot about physicians, but I also work a lot with nurses. And this retrogression in EB3 has slowed, if not stopped, a lot of immigration of nurses to the United States since May when they first retrogressed. And the number had first gone back to June 2022. And then just in the last month or so, went back even further to February. And, that's a product of the fact that most or a lot of nurses process their green cards abroad. So when the Department of State was so backed up or when they couldn't issue those green cards, the EB3 category had moved far ahead. In fact, EB3 India was way far ahead of EB2 India. And we had a lot of people moving back and forth between the two. That has changed now because so many people have been able to get their green cards abroad that now there's a backlog for everybody in that category. So you can kind of see how the recovery from COVID operations has been good and we're back to normal processing times, but it's also really highlighted the shortage of green cards that we have. So this is the final action chart. So again, final action means these are the priority dates that are current now. In this month for approval. So what in the world is the filing dates chart and why are there two charts? Back during the Obama administration, they were looking for a way to allow people to file adjustment of status applications a little bit earlier to take advantage of the benefits of being able to file those applications, right? Those benefits include being able to apply for EADs, work cards, advanced parole travel documents, and also the ability to become portable once that adjustment of status application is pending for 180 days. You can, potentially change jobs and bring the benefit of that green card with you to another job and not have to ask that employer to do yet another labor certification and I-140 and all of that. So the idea of this filing date chart, because under the law, in order to file an adjustment of status application, a visa has to be immediately available. So this filing date chart was devised based on the government's assessment of what priority dates, what that visa availability is going to look like at the end of the fiscal year. Where do they think the numbers are going to go? And if they think these numbers would be current during the fiscal year, that would allow for the filing of those adjustment of status applications earlier than if we just went by the final action date. And then for many years, USCIS didn't allow us to use the filing date chart to file employment-based adjustments. They did in 2020. They have done it a bunch of times since then. But basically what happens is the visa bulletin comes out each month and we see the two charts. And then a day or so later, USCIS comes out and pronounces which chart we need to use to file what kind of application. And so right now, these numbers for July 2023 look great, right? India is over a year ahead in EB2, right? There's a 3-year difference in EB3 India between final action and filing dates. That's just mind-boggling. But USCIS says we can't use this to file adjustment applications in July. We can only go by the final action date. And that goes back to my assessment that they're using the visa bulletin to quell demand, right? We only want to use the most harsh dates to tell people when they can file their applications. So that's what's going on, between the two charts on the visa bulletin. So, when I do an assessment of the visa bulletin every month, I sometimes don't put a lot of stock in the filing dates chart because I could probably count on my 2 hands, maybe a foot, but probably just on my 2 hands, how many times USCIS has allowed us to use the filing date charts for employment-based cases since they started this in like 2012 or whatever year it was. It doesn't happen often. So the Department of State spends a lot of time, collaborating with USCIS to create these charts, but then usually we're relegated to the final action chart. At the times when those filing date charts can be used, we start, all immigration lawyers start furiously contacting our clients to say, hey, we can file an adjustment for you now, because typically the filing date chart is way ahead of the final action date chart, because that's the whole point, right? To try to get you in position to be able to file your adjustment application earlier than you otherwise might. And it is super frustrating that USCIS doesn't just automatically allow us to use it every month, because you wonder, like, why do they keep producing it if in most months, USCIS doesn't let us use it to file. I also should mention that there's no, the filing date chart really has no applicability for people applying from outside the United States. So if you're, going to be applying at a US consulate or embassy, there's nothing you're filing based on this chart. You're going entirely by the final action chart in terms of when a visa can be issued to you. So those are the two charts. So, when I go back and forth between them, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but, there's really in the India categories, just a hugely stark contrast between the final action and filing dates chart. And I remember when this visa bulletin came out, we were all just like gasping at how could there be that much time, that span of time between them. And I really don't think that this filing date chart is at all accurate in the India categories. We have 2 months left in the fiscal year. And I think the government is hard pressed to get from, January 1st, 2011 over, and have that jump over a year in the next 2 months. Especially as they're telling us that they're going to issue all available green cards this year, and they're getting really close to doing that. I just don't know how it's going to move forward that far. And I'm a little worried, as I mentioned before, about what happens in October. October is usually like our most hopeful month because all of the green cards are available. And then we see the visa bulletin incrementally move forward with that optimistic, start of the year kind of energy. But with all of the visas maybe being used this year and there being little to no spill down, there aren't going to be that many green cards available next year, right? We're going to be at baseline levels. So I don't know how far ahead the government is going to be willing to move the visa bulletin and how many people they're going to be provoking to file applications early on in the fiscal year until they can kind of get a handle on what everything looks like. So we may not see as much forward movement in October as we're hoping. But again, I don't know. I'm not the one that's crunching the numbers, thank goodness, because it would really be wrong. But we're really going to have to see what happens, in mid-September when we get that visa bulletin for October. So, what's next? Usually at this time, I'm like, oh, there are these bills pending in Congress, or there's some litigation going on to challenge this or that. Right now, things are actually really quiet. We're, on the cusp of an election year. Immigration has just become an absolutely toxic word to use on Capitol Hill. There is not a lot of appetite for expanding anything. There are bills out there. I think the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act is an amazing bill. It has a lot of broad bipartisan support. One of the challenges of that bill and other bills like it, because there's even legislation out there that would help modernize the Conrad 30 waiver programs and also have some green card relief in that. And there's some other. One of the challenges about immigration legislation is that these bills are pretty tiny. They don't, bills like that typically don't pass on their own. And because they're immigration related, nobody wants to pass them on their own, because then it's so glaring that they passed an immigration reform bill. So typically they have to be appended to some other larger legislation that's going through Congress. And it seems like every time one of these bills gets appended to something, the larger bill fails and it doesn't go anywhere. And so the good immigration reform that we need ends up failing too. I don't know of any really concrete efforts though right now, even though these bills are introduced, they're certainly there. You are welcome to contact your senators and congressional representatives to advocate for these bills. But I really don't know that there's strong political momentum to really push them through to passage. I hope I'm wrong. That would be great. I would love to be wrong about that. But we've kind of seen that merry-go-round, that carousel happen quite a bit over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. And, so far it hasn't been successful. I think the hardest thing about the green card backlog and about the visa bulletin in general is just the unknown. From month to month, we don't know where it's going. From year to year, we don't know where it's going. So, at the beginning, I said, I can't really answer your visa bulletin questions in terms of like, when might you get a green card? Because I don't know, that October 2020, surge in filings was unexpected. The USCIS inability to issue all the available green cards the following year was unexpected. So we just don't know. I can tell you just anecdotally from my own practice, most of my clients with priority dates 2011 and earlier have received green cards sometime in the last several years. I have one client with a 2011 date who has not received his, but that's a long story. And there's a reason for that. My clients with 2012 priority dates, it's a mixed bag. And I even had one client with a 2013 priority date receive a green card. There might've been a couple of those. But from 2012 on, it's a mixed bag, and certainly no clients with priority dates after 2013 have received green cards, because the final action chart has never gotten there for EB2 or EB3 India. In October 2020, what went to January 2015 was the filing dates chart, right? So we went way ahead. We got to file a bunch of cases. Most of those cases are still pending. And since then, things just keep moving backward instead of forward. So, that's all, that's what all I have to go on is what's happening in my own practice in terms of what expectations should be. For somebody who's having a green card process initiated for them now and might have a priority date in 2022 or 23 or 24, there are a lot of studies out there about, how long the wait might be for Indian nationals. I don't know that I fully trust all of that speculation. Because I've been reliably seeing 10 to 11 years for most of my clients, but I know that demand has exponentially gone up over the last 10 years. So where things were 10 years ago or 15 years ago when we started a case, things are very different now. Do I believe that the green card backlog is, 50 years long or, 100 years long or whatever? I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows that. And hopefully, there will be some legislation to fix this, or some policy, additional policy changes to help at least relieve the burden of these lengthy waits at some point. And maybe, maybe the fact that the rest of the world is now feeling some of that backlog pain. Misery loves company. And so I know that, voices have been pretty loud over time, seeking green card relief, and maybe the overall backlogs we're seeing will lend some extra voices that were sorely needed in that discussion. So only time will tell. We'll need to see what happens. But I think I've reached the end of my presentation a little bit early. So I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. My contact information is here. You are welcome. I didn't put our website there, but our website is also visalaw.com. You're welcome to contact me, outside of this webinar, or to schedule a consultation on our website. We'd be happy to chat with you. And we have some other wonderful attorneys on our healthcare team as well, who also are available if you have questions. So I will stop there.
Yep, like she said, if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to put those in the chat and Q&A now. We'll hang around here for a couple minutes just in case there's questions. I would like to say thank you for your time this evening, Elissa, and thank you everyone for attending. If you like this webinar, she will also be presenting later on this year, I think one more this year. And then we also have other webinars on our website as well for you guys to check out. So.
Oh. So updates to the visa bulletin come out every month, and I can go back actually in the, there was a question about where to get guidelines, but so the visa bulletin is available every month at this link, but that's a very complicated link. If you just Google the month, the year, and visa bulletin, it'll be the first thing that comes up on Google. So like I got there today by just putting in July 2023 visa bulletin, and it was the first thing that came up. And it comes out every month in the middle of the month. So we should get the August visa bulletin any day now. The other thing I should have mentioned, and actually that was a good question, is that at the bottom of the visa bulletin, after all the charts, there usually are some notes that the Department of State provides, and these are publicly available. This is not just to immigration lawyers, but this is why I say always read the whole thing, because when you get down to the bottom, there are notes about what to maybe expect in a coming visa bulletin. They don't get super detailed with it, but they do give us some idea of what might be coming and what to be prepared for. Yeah, so somebody is saying that they filed an adjustment application at the end of February, and they had their fingerprinting done, and since then nothing's happened, and that's pretty normal. You might get a work card, you might get your travel document, it might take longer. The one thing I will caution is the government is all over the place on processing times. So I've had cases approved in 4 months, I've had cases approved in 9 months, I've had cases approved in 15 months. I've had cases where the work card came and then a week later we got the green card. We've had cases where we got the green card and never even got the work card or travel document because the green card came so fast. So it's really, all over the map. So no news is good news at this point. If you find your case, honestly, the government probably won't even take a request that your case is taking too long until it's pending well over a year. But for now, you're within 6-7 months, you're right where you should be. And I would expect you'll probably hear something in the next few months. And my contact information is on the screen. You have my email address, our firm's phone number, and then our website is www.visalaw.com. And there's a link there where you can schedule a consultation. And you're welcome to email me as well. So any other questions? Well, it was great to be with you all, and thanks so much for the questions and for your attention, and best wishes with your Visa Bulletin challenges. And if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elissa.